Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading Manitou Blood by Graham Masterton, and this week we will be reading the final chapters of the story. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy the story. Chapter 22, Blood Group. I felt something cool and wet on my stomach. I opened my eyes and Jenica was wiping the writing off of my skin with a makeup removal pad. "Did you sleep well?" she asked me. "Give me a chance. I've only been lying here for a couple of minutes." "You've been sleeping for 9 hours. It's 1:10 in the afternoon." I sat up. "What? You're kidding me." But the clock next to the bed said 1:09, and through the triangular crack in the curtains I could see that the sun was shining. Jenica had changed into a black and white check shirt and tight blue Levi's, and she had brushed her hair back and tied it with a black scarf. "Why didn't you wake me up earlier? Come on, Jenica. If we're going to go after Miss Kumakas, we need all the daylight we can get." "Shh. You slept so long because you were exhausted. Besides, you needed time to absorb the stregoica strain into your bloodstream." "Oh yeah, I forgot. I'm half a vampire now." I rubbed the back of my head. "I don't feel any different, apart from having a bean like a bowling ball." "Believe me, Harry, you are different. You can do things now that you could never do before. Look." She took hold of my right hand and pulled back my index finger. It was incredible. Without any effort at all, it bent right over until it was practically touching the back of my wrist. I tried my middle finger, and I could bend it back just as far. "That's fantastic. Harry Erskine, the India rubber fortune teller. He unravels your future while he ties himself in knots." I bent back all of my other fingers, and they were just as flexible. "There's something else," said Jenica. "While you were sleeping, I went downstairs. I did what you suggested and pushed my hand into the mirror." "Don't tell me it wouldn't go in." "At first, no. I had to try 3 times, but then it happened. But only when I said to myself, 'Jenica, this is nothing but a doorway. It needs very strong faith, I think, as well as stregoica blood.'" "Well, thank God. I'd hate to think that what we did last night was a waste of time." "Why don't you dress now? Try some of my father's clothes. I will make us some coffee." I got up, drew back the drapes, and stretched myself. To my amazement, I found that I could lean over backward almost as far as Jenica could. Actually, I did feel different, looser somehow, more active and alive, as if I were 10 years younger. I rummaged through Razvan Dragomir's closet and found a black silk shirt and a pair of black pants. The pants were a little too snug, but Razvan Dragomir probably didn't drink 9 cans of Guinness every day. I went into the kitchen where Jenica was making coffee with club soda, which was the only water we had left. There was no milk, of course, so I ate handfuls of cornflakes out of the box. "We need to go to the Kensico Country Inn while it's still daylight," I said. "We need to check out how many mirrors they have. And after what happened yesterday with that guy coming out of the bathtub, I think we should scout around for any kind of reflective water surface, too. Rain barrels, ponds, that kind of thing." "Then we wait till it gets dark, yes? And Vasily Loop comes out of his mirror?" "You've got it. While he's away, we break every mirror in the whole place so that when he comes back at sunrise, he doesn't have any place to hide. That's when you recite the disenchantment. Vasily Loop will be sent back to where he came from, and that leaves Miss Kumakas without a spirit to hide himself in." "But you still don't know how you will destroy your Miss Kumakas." I'm counting on that bone. Is that all? What else can I do? Agreed, I don't have any idea what it does, or how it works, or why, but it seems to keep the strigoi at bay, doesn't it? And it can kill rats better than Ramic Green, and Miss Kumakis didn't seem to be at all happy when I waved it at him. And that is all of your plan? Well, I guess so. I can't think of anything else I can do. Maybe you should call on your singing rock. I shook my head. He won't answer me, Jenica. I've already asked him for far too much help, and he's a great believer in working things out for yourself. Don't keep looking to dead people for advice. That's his motto, or you might as well be dead yourself. Okay, said Jenica. Then what shall we do? Go? I finished my coffee, stood up, and said, Why not? You only live once. Jenica said, I have one question. Once we step into the mirror, how do we find our way to the Kensico Country Inn? In the ordinary way, I guess, except back to front. You are not making me feel very confident. Jenica, the whole world has gone crazy. 9/11 was madness, but this is even madder. Let's just try and take it as it comes. It's the only way. She looked at me acutely. You lost something very special, didn't you, when you lost your wife and your daughter? I never lost them. I mislaid them. That's all. You must never think that life is not really worth living. There is somebody waiting for you, somewhere. Maybe. Right now I have a vengeful Native American wonder worker to deal with. Jenica packed her woven bag with her crucifix and her holy water and her book of Svarkalaki. I took nothing except the bone. We went downstairs to the hallway and stood in front of the mirror. Jenica said to me, Try it first with your finger. Make sure that you can pass through it. I looked at my reflection in my black silk shirt and my tight black pants. I reminded myself of an out-of-work conjurer. And now, for my next astounding trick, I will push my finger into the surface of this absolutely genuine, real mirror, and it will penetrate the glass as if by magic. Which it did. The sensation was extraordinary. I felt as if the glass was clinging to my finger, cold and heavy and liquid, like mercury. But my finger went in and joined up with the finger in my reflection, and then it came out again, unharmed. I turned to Jenica and said, How about that? How about that? Then you see, the ritual of Samudeva really works. I am half a vampire. Shit, I can't believe it. Now you have strigoi in your blood, yes. Now you are the same as me. Suddenly I felt very serious. I had taken risks before. I had fought against Miss Kumakis before. But this time I didn't think that either of us had much of a chance of surviving. I lifted Jenica's chin and kissed her. At least nobody can say that we didn't go out with a bang. I decided that I would go first. If something went seriously wrong, I told Jenica that she should stay where she was and not try to follow me. Even with Miss Kumakis spreading strigoi all across the northeastern states, she would stand some chance of staying alive. I stood right in front of the mirror. Harry Erskine, this is a very bad idea. You don't know where the hell you're going or what you're going to do when you get there. But I stepped forward, and I knew and I utterly believed that the mirror was a silver doorway and that it led right through the frame into a world of reflections. I closed my eyes. I felt a hard, cold, silent collision, like falling from the top diving board into a swimming pool and rolling around in noisily bubbling water. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself standing in a hallway, but a very different hallway than the one I had just left. It was light and airy, with a polished wood floor and double doors that were open onto a white stone porch. A warm wind was blowing in from outside, and I could hear birds singing. Strangely, Jenica was standing next to me here, while a second Jenica was still staring at us from the hallway that I had just left. I was here, inside the mirror. I was through. "Come on," I waved at Jenica, mouthing my words as if she were deaf. "I think it's okay." I wasn't sure that she could hear me, but she slowly approached the mirror, and her reflection approached the mirror just as slowly, until they were both standing with their hands pressed against each other, looking into each other's eyes. "It's okay," I shouted. "You can do it." She hesitated a moment longer, and then she lowered her head and walked through. There was a sound like crushing glass and a sparkling explosion of colors and shapes. Jenica and her reflections seemed to smash themselves softly together into one person. Then there was just the two of us, side by side, and the hallway we had left behind was empty. Jenica stared at me. "Where are we? What is this place?" "I don't know. I thought that if we went through the mirror, we'd simply end up in the same hallway, only in reverse. But, well, apparently not." Jenica walked over to an antique satinwood bureau and stared up at an oil painting of a man in a curly white wig. "I do not understand this," she said. "Maybe it is better if we go back." I crossed the hallway to the double doors and stepped out onto the porch. I had expected to see Leroy Street. Well, you would, even if it was spelled backwards. But outside the front door there was a wide, empty courtyard and an avenue of maple trees with a white fence running beside it. Through the maple trees I could see a circular pond shining, with geese on it, and in the distance lay a range of hills with low clouds lying on top of them like down comforters. There was no sign of Leroy Street, no sign of Manhattan at all. On the wall there was a sign saying, "No parking," and the writing was the right way round, not a mirror image at all. So this wasn't Looking Glass Land. We had simply walked through one mirror in Manhattan and out of another, someplace else altogether. But where? Jenica came out and stood beside me, shading her eyes against the glare. The sky was filled with thick white cumulus clouds, although there were one or two ragged fragments of blue. The air was warm and humid, and I could actually smell freshly mown grass. 2 silver SUVs were parked beside a stable block, but there was no sign of any life. "Maybe this is a dream or some kind of hallucination," said Jenica. "It gives me a very bad feeling." We went back inside. In one corner of the hallway stood an antique desk with a visitor's book lying open on it. I went over and picked the book up. There was blood spattered across the pages, and when I looked down, there was blood on the floor, too. I closed the book and read the inscription on the green leather cover. "We don't need to go back. Don't you get it? This isn't a dream. This is the Kensico Country Inn." "But how? How did we get to be here, exactly where we wanted to be?" "I don't have any idea, but my guess is that Frank had something to do with this. It was like he came through the mirror, and somehow he left the door open so that we could come back." "But how did we manage to go through the mirror in my house and find ourselves here? It is like the 2 houses are standing side by side. yet we know that they are miles and miles apart. You're right, but when the vampire gatherer came out of the mirror in your apartment and Susan Fireman took Frank away with her, you didn't see your corridor reflected in that mirror, did you? You saw some beach someplace. Whatever goes on in back of mirrors, it seems to me like the usual laws of physics definitely don't apply. Jenica looked up at me. Then she licked her middle finger and rubbed it against the side of my cheek. 2 enormous mirrors hung in the lobby of the Kensico Country Inn, one behind the reception desk and the other in the corridor, the silver door through which Jenica and I had stepped to get here. When the time came, these would be the first 2 for us to smash. We wouldn't be able to go back to the city the same way that we had arrived, but we couldn't leave Miss Komakis any escape routes. We went along the corridor to the Valhalla restaurant and bar. There were 30 tables, all set for breakfast, with shining white tablecloths and cleverly folded napkins. On each table stood a vase of dead roses. "There's a long mirror behind the bar," said Jenica. "Another one over there, beside the kitchen door." The kitchens were deserted. On the wood-block table in the center lay 3 whole legs of lamb on plates. They were crawling with blowflies, and the smell of rancid lamb fat was enough to make Jenica press her hand over her face. We returned to the reception area and opened up every door, one after the other. A cloakroom, a closet, men's and women's restrooms, plenty of mirrors to be broken there, and a corridor that led along the back of the inn to a large glass conservatory. We were only on the first floor, and we had counted over 35 mirrors already. Jenica went up a low flight of 3 stairs and opened the door at the top. "Harry," she said, "what's wrong?" I followed her up the stairs and looked into the room. It was obviously a conference room with a projection screen at the far end and an easel with a brightly colored business graph on it. But I wasn't looking at the display. In the center of the room stood a long boardroom table made of pale polished oak with at least 40 matching chairs. The table was heaped high with bodies, arms and legs all tangled together. Men and women, some of them still wearing business suits, some of them naked, but all with their throats cut wide open. There must have been more than 30 of them, although I didn't feel like making an exact count. Maggots were silently dropping off them and squirming across the carpet. The lamb had smelled sickening enough, but this was 10 times worse. I closed the door and exhaled. There was nothing that we could do. Obviously, the vampire gatherer and some of his strigoi had arrived here through the mirrors the same way that we had, and taken the hotel staff and guests by surprise. They wouldn't have been shown any mercy. As far as Vasily Loop was concerned, human beings were nothing more than a source of sustenance or recruits for his ever-increasing legion of strigoi. And as far as Miss Komakis was concerned, this, at long last, was his glorious revenge. It took us nearly 2 hours to search the whole of the Kensico Country Inn for mirrors. We even searched the maids' bedrooms and the attic rooms and took the makeup mirrors out of their purses and collected them together, ready to be smashed. The power was out, the phones were dead, and all I could hear on my cell phone was a distant crackling. The strigoi must have taken over much more of New York State than we knew. All through that afternoon, not a single vehicle passed along the main highway at the end of the drive, and we didn't hear a single airplane or a single helicopter. All we heard was bird song. We went back to the kitchens. Although the refrigerators had stopped working, we found some Monterey Jack cheese and some Italian salami that were slightly sweaty but still edible. We took them outside and sat on the grass overlooking the pond. The sun was beginning to sink toward the distant hills. Can you imagine what this country would be like if the Strigoi took over? I asked Jenica. Deserted during the day, just like this. Silent. Nothing would happen except at night. Then they'd all come crawling out of their coffins and creeping out of their mirrors, and it would be hell on earth. If you were still human, your life wouldn't be worth living. They'd be hunting for you every single night. Jenica said, Of course, but to some people that would not be hell, but a sort of heaven. We would live forever, yes? And so we would be able to experience everything, every taste, every sensation, and visit every wonder that the world had to offer. My father once said that if everybody lived forever, human learning would blossom beyond our wildest imagination, because great scholars would never die the way they do now. He said, Think of Einstein, how much was lost when Einstein died, and what more he could have done if he had lived for another 3 centuries. Think of some of our greatest writers and our greatest musicians. But what can any of us hope to learn in the space of a human lifetime? Hardly anything at all, and when we breathe our last breath, even the tiny fraction of knowledge that we have acquired so painfully is buried with us, beyond the reach of our sons and daughters, or anybody else who might benefit from it. Sounds like your father is a pretty radical kind of guy. He is a very original thinker. He always used to tell me that we should never be prejudiced against any idea, just believe it was the thought of by somebody we despise. Much brilliant science came from the Nazis, for instance, and much great art from some of the world's most oppressive regimes. So even if we don't exactly approve of their dietary habits, we should appreciate the Strigoi because they've been around so long and because they know so much? Jenica didn't answer me, but turned toward the pond. The sun was even lower now, a sullen, smoky red, and it was reflected in the water so that there were 2 suns. The pond, she said. What are we going to do about that? It is outside, yes, but even if the sun is shining, I think there is a chance that the Strigoi might be able to reach it and escape. I stood up and walked around the edge of the pond. Near the house, the bank was higher, and there was a cluster of bulrushes in one corner. On the opposite side, where the ground sloped away, the bank had been artificially built up, and there was a short concrete dam and a stopcock. Look at this, I said. They must use this to drain the water when they want to clean it. Then we can empty it while Vasily Loop is away. We can try. I don't know how long it's going to take. It was beginning to grow damp and chilly. Jenica took hold of my arm and pulled me closer. This is a very strange adventure we are having, you and me. I nodded and thought of the other women who had said that to me not so long ago. As it grew dark, we climbed into one of the SUVs, a Toyota Land Cruiser. We decided that it was probably safer than hiding in the inn because the Strigoi would be less likely to pick up the warmth of our blood. Not only that, the owner had left the keys in it, and if the Strigoi did realize that we were there, we could burn rubber out of there. We were cautious enough to stop using the words Strigoi and Strigoika and the name Vasily Loop. Now that night had fallen, the vampires and the vampire gatherer would be stirring inside their mirrors, and they would be hungry and highly sensitive to any disturbance that would indicate the closeness of human blood. We hunched down in the front seats as low as we could, and we shared 3 chocolate bars and a small pack of peanuts. I kept thinking about Katz's salt beef sandwiches, sliced very thin and very rare, and I wondered if that was anything to do with my newly acquired vampirism. But maybe I was just hungry. I doubt if vampires like rye bread and pickles to go with their blood. Over an hour went by, and Jenica leaned her head against my shoulder and started to breathe deeper and slower, with occasional gasps, as if she were dreaming. I was almost nodding off myself when I saw a dark, irregular shape coming out of the inn and crossing the porch. It was followed by another, and another, and then a paler shape. Strigoi, at least 5 of them. They came down the steps and walked across the driveway until they were standing together less than 20 feet away. I nudged Jenica, and she said, What is it? Shh, keep down, look. The Strigoi appeared to be waiting for something. The moon hadn't yet risen, but the night sky was gradually beginning to grow lighter, and after a while I could see that the pale shape was a woman with dark hair. She turned and looked toward us, and I realized that it was Susan Fireman. Standing next to her, looking white-faced and very wild, was Frank. I didn't know the other 3 Strigoi. One of them was very tall, with slicked back hair, like Christopher Lee. Even if he hadn't been a real vampire, he could have easily passed for one. The other 2 looked like construction workers, shaven-headed and heavily built. At last the moon appeared, shining through the silver birches like a horrified face. As its light brightened, a huge figure emerged from the doorway. It sloped away from the moon, this figure, a complex arrangement of impenetrable shadows, and it kept shifting and changing and disassembling itself with every step. It was the vampire gatherer, Vasily Loop, the Svarkalaki, the one in whose spirit Miss Quimacus was concealed, like the blackest of moths folded inside a chrysalis. 1 second, the vampire gatherer was standing on the porch. The next, in the blink of an eye, he was standing among his Strigoi. I could see his face shifting, benign and human one moment, white and mask-like the next. Then, without warning, he turned his head around. "Oh, my God," said Jenica. "Do you think he's seen us?" It certainly looked as if he had. He was staring directly toward the land cruiser, and his eyes were shining. For one terrible moment, I thought, "Oh, shit. This little escapade is going to end for us before it's even begun, and end bloodily, too." The vampire gatherer appeared to lurch toward us, and the Strigoi turned around too. But then, jerkily, like characters in a badly chopped art movie, they all vanished and reappeared halfway down the drive. They vanished again, and the next thing we knew, they were down by the road, more than 100 yards away. Another blink, and they were utterly gone. Jenica puffed out her cheeks in relief. "Where do you think they're going?" I asked her. "Who knows? Some small town somewhere, I expect. It is the way they always spread, like a stain." We climbed out of the land cruiser. The first thing I did was cross the driveway and walk down to the far side of the pond. I knelt down on the concrete dam and tried to turn the stopcock, but it was rusted up and it wouldn't budge. "I'll have to find some kind of lever," I said. "Listen, you get inside and start breaking mirrors." Together we walked quickly back toward the inn. Inside the lobby, I went straight to the antique fireplace. There was a large woven basket next to it containing a small hatchet and fire tongs and a long iron poker with a heavy brass knob on the end. I gave the hatchet to Jenica and said, "Okay, get smashing, and for God's sake, don't miss any, not one." She went straight up to the huge gilt-framed mirror behind the reception desk and hit it dead center with the back of the hatchet. With a sharp crack, the whole mirror split diagonally from side to side and then dropped onto the floor. Jenica stamped on the larger pieces to break them up even smaller, and then she bashed up the fragments so that it was impossible for anybody to see a coherent reflection in them. As I went back outside, I heard her break the mirror in the corridor and start to pulverize that with her hatchet, too. I jogged down to the pond. The night air was thick with mosquitoes, and I had to spit one out of my mouth. I knelt down on the dam again and inserted the end of the poker into the stopcock. Then I stood up and hauled back on it as hard as I could. I made a whole lot of effortful noises, like "ah" and "grrr," but it still wouldn't move, and I began to think that it was rusted up solid. Then I thought, you're half Strigoi. You have the strength. If you can bend yourself backward, you can open this stopcock. Have faith in yourself, Harry. Believe in what you can do. I repositioned my hands, and then I hauled on the poker again, gritting my teeth with effort. This time I heard a harsh grating noise, and the stopcock actually moved. I hauled again, and it suddenly turned, and water started to trickle out the drain pipe that ran under the dam. Now the stopcock was loose enough for me to turn it by hand, and the trickle turned into a gush. Within a few minutes, water was pouring across the field below the pond and shining in the moonlight like the Mississippi Delta. I picked up the poker and ran back to the inn. Jenica was in the woman's restroom now, smashing all the mirrors over the wash basins. "Haven't you done the man's yet?" "I didn't like to. I left that for you." "There's nobody in there, for God's sake." Hour after hour, room by room, we smashed every single mirror in the Kensico Country Inn. The moon watched us through one window after another, and then finally sank out of sight. Every now and then we stopped smashing and listened in case we heard Vasily Loop and his Strigoi coming back. But even when the sky flushed pink and the birds started to twitter, they still hadn't returned, and we had finished. We made a last thorough check, going from one end of the inn to the other, opening closets in case we had missed a mirror that was screwed to the back of a door. We even opened up nightstand drawers in case somebody had left a vanity mirror next to his Gideon Bible. Broken glass glittered everywhere, and not a single piece of it was large enough for anyone to see one eye in. I had even gone outside and smashed the rear-view mirrors of the 2 SUVs parked in the driveway. During the night, the level of the pond had fallen dramatically, revealing heaps of soggy green chickweed and slime-covered rocks and a child's rusted scooter. There was still an oval-shaped pool of water remaining, about 2 feet deep and 20 feet across, but it continued to pour steadily out of the drain pipe, and I reckoned that it wouldn't take longer than 20 minutes before it was totally drained. I looked toward the east. The rim of the sun was just beginning to nibble at the trees. "They must be back soon," said Jenica. "I pray that they didn't find themselves another place to hide." "I pray, too." We went into the inn and hid in the corner of the lobby, between the heavy blue drapes and a long case clock. Jenica took out her crucifix and her holy water and laid them on the windowsill. Then she took out the book of Svarkalaki and turned to the page where Vasily Loop's disenchantment was printed. "You're ready?" I asked her. She looked at me with that unreadable expression again. I was just about to say something else when there was a deafening bang like a bomb going off. The vampire gatherer came storming into the lobby, accompanied by his 5 strigoi. He seemed even bigger and darker than he had before, and this time the whole band of them were trailing clouds of smoke. They must have been caught by the sunlight just as they arrived back outside. They circled around the lobby, beating at their burning coats. All 5 of the strigoi had bloody chins, and the fronts of their clothes were drenched in blood like slaughterhouse workers. At first, they were too preoccupied with extinguishing their smoldering clothes to notice that anything was different. It was only when the smoke was beginning to clear that the vampire gatherer screamed in bewilderment and rage. He stalked up to the broken mirrors and then twisted around, his shadows slanting away from the windows. His face was contorted with anger, and it seemed as if his shadows were actually bristling. Susan Fireman ran across to the mirror in the corridor, the one that Jenica and I had used to get here. When she saw that this mirror was broken too, she let out a moan of dread. She must have realized what had happened, and she could guess what the outcome was going to be. The tall strigoi opened the doors to the restrooms. The other 2 hurried up the stairs to the conference room. But yes, Jenica and I had even been back in there, where the bodies were all heaped up. We had broken the 3 floor-to-ceiling mirrors that stood between the windows, and we had searched the pockets of the dead. Of all the strigoi, Frank alone stayed where he was, in the center of the lobby. His head was bowed, and smoke was creeping out from under his coat. Susan Fireman came up to him with her pale eyes staring. "It was you! This was your doing, isn't it? I trusted you, Frank. I trusted you. I could have cut your throat and drunk your blood, but I gave you immortality. Where are they, Frank? Where are they? You brought them here, didn't you? You went to see them, and you left the mirrors back to back." The vampire gatherer came up behind Susan Fireman and stared at Frank with such hatred that I felt my skin on my bare scalp shrinking. Frank lifted his head and looked up at him. A thin bar of sunlight was shining across the polished wood floor, and Frank's shoes were starting to smolder. "You forgot one thing," said Frank, and he sounded infinitely tired. "When some people make promises, they make them because they intend to keep them, even after death. I promised to value human life, and not even you could force me to go back on that." Susan Fireman took 2 quick steps toward him. She was so quick that I didn't see the knife in her hand. All I saw was a semicircular spray of blood, like a bright red fan, and then Frank pitched backward, with his head falling sideways from his neck, as if it was attached by a hinge. The vampire gatherer let out another scream, and this time it sounded like a whole choir. Thousands of tortured souls screaming in unison. He took one ungainly lurch toward Frank's body, and then another. "Now!" I told Jenica, and pushed her out from the curtain. Chapter 23. Manitou Blood. The vampire gatherer and his strigoi turned to stare at Jenica in astonishment and anger. The strigoi were probably the scariest bunch that you could ever meet, with their wild eyes and their blood-soaked coats and smoke pouring out of their collars. But Vasily Loop was a nightmare. The way he kept slanting from one side to the other, and his face shifted and altered from blandness to fury, all in nothing but a few seconds. What was even more frightening about him was that Miss Quamacus was hiding inside him, giving him an overwhelming vengefulness far greater than he had ever possessed before, even as a Svarkalaki. But Jenica, God bless her, she walked toward them as if they didn't frighten her at all. She held up her jewel-studded crucifix, and she sprayed her holy water from side to side, and she recited the words of the disenchantment in a high, precise voice. I dismiss you, Vasily Loop. I disperse your spirit. Let the earth take back the flesh it has given you, and the wind take back the breath it has given you, and the rivers take back their blood. Let the ashes of your soul be scattered like the ashes of your body. The vampire gatherer tilted forward and roared at her. But Jenica lashed him again with holy water and shouted, I dismiss you, Vasily Loop. May your memory vanish with the dying day, and your name be washed from the lips of all who ever spoke it. May the stars forget that they ever guided your destiny, and the moon deny that you ever walked beneath her. Now the vampire gatherer took one staggering step toward her. He opened his mouth, and then another mouth appeared, and yet another, and his screaming made the whole building reverberate, as if a jet bomber were flying right over us. Jenica turned the page in her book, and she was just about to recite the final dismissal when Susan Fireman rushed toward her and grabbed the book in both hands. Jenica tried to pull it away from her, but Susan Fireman twisted it free. Harry! Shouted Jenica. Susan Fireman was heading for the open doors with the book held close to her chest. I dodged out from behind the curtains and tried to cut her off, but she was too quick for me. She ran down the steps and across the driveway, straight into the rays of the rising sun. She hadn't run more than 20 feet before smoke began to billow out of her coat. As I ran after her, it blew thicker and thicker, and she began to slow down. Suddenly her hair caught fire, and she screamed in agony. Harry, the book! Shouted Jenica. Don't let her burn the book! But it was too late. Susan Fireman had only just reached the grassy slope that led down to the pond when she exploded into flame. She fell sideways and rolled over and over, blazing fiercely. I caught up with her and tried to snatch the book, but she was clutching it too close to her, and the heat that rippled up from her was so intense that I couldn't get within 3 feet of her without burning my hands. She had stopped screaming now, and she was simply lying in a fetal position on the grass, staring up at me, as the sun cremated her. The skin on her face blistered and blackened. Her lips swelled up and cracked. I could see her finger bones appearing through the charred flesh of her hands. The smell of scorched wool and barbecued meat was so strong that I couldn't stop retching. I swear to God that she smiled at me. I don't know why. Maybe she had always suspected that it would come to this. Even though she was one of the Strigoi, maybe she still felt some remorse for the people she had murdered. Harry! Called Jenica. I was about to turn around when Susan Fireman blew up in a pick-a-stick scattering of blackened bones. The book lay among the wreckage of her burned body, its ashy pages curling up one by one, and I could see that it was beyond saving. Harry, they're getting away! Now I looked back to see the vampire gatherer and the 3 remaining Strigoi running across the driveway toward the pond. The oval of water had shrunk even more, but there was still enough reflective surface for Vasily Loop to escape. I drew the decorated bone out of my belt and started to run toward the pond, too. I was sweating and panting and cursing the name of Guinness Breweries with every step. Smoke was pouring from the vampire gatherer's shadows, and by the time they reached the grass, the 3 strigoi were actually alight, with flames flapping behind them like orange flags. "Harry, you have to stop them!" I don't know how I managed to run down to that pond so fast. Maybe Singing Rock had summoned up the spirit of wind to get behind my back and blow me there. Maybe Adelaide Bright caught hold of one hand and Frank Winter caught hold of the other, and they pulled me along because they didn't want to have died for nothing. Whatever it was, I came hurtling down that slope with my arms rotating like windmills, and I splashed knee-deep into the water while the vampire gatherer was still 30 feet away from me. The 3 strigoi didn't stand a chance. They were still only halfway down the slope before they exploded, and their fiery remains were strewn across the grass. I stood in the water, facing the vampire gatherer, and I held up the bone. "That's it, Loop. Don't come any further." The vampire gatherer's shadows were slanting at almost 45 degrees away from the sun, and so much black smoke was pouring out of him that I could hardly see his face. He was burning. He was seething with anger, but he stopped where he was. Whatever power that bone contained, it held much more power than the sun. I saw flames amid the smoke, and the vampire gatherer screamed at me with 1,000 voices, like a congregation trapped in a burning cathedral. "You stay there," I shouted at him. "You and Miss Clomacus both." I was still standing there with the bone upraised when I saw a black SUV speeding up the driveway between the maple trees. Jenica was hurrying down toward me, but she must have seen it too, because she stopped and stared at it and shaded her eyes. Without slowing down, the SUV left the driveway and drove between the trees. It came directly toward us, over the grass, and only 20 yards away, it stopped. A man in a gray shirt and gray pants climbed out of it and came hurrying toward me. "Get the hell out of here!" I yelled at him. "Do you want to get yourself killed?" But the man ignored me and came splashing into the water to stand beside me. He was 50-ish, with greased back hair and a hooked nose. A complicated earring dangled from his left ear, silver and feathery, like a miniature dream catcher. "I am Razvan Dragomir," he said. Then, as if I hadn't heard him, "I am Razvan Dragomir." "What the hell? You're supposed to be in Bucharest, aren't you?" "I have always been here. It is too long to explain. Quick, you must let the Svarkolaki into the water before he burns." "Excuse me? I don't think so. Don't you know what this sucker has done to New York City? He's killed thousands." The vampire gatherer roared again. More flames were lapping through his shadows, and smoke was trailing all the way across the grassy slope and through the trees. Jenica was skirting around him, one hand lifted to protect her face from the heat, and she was looking totally baffled. "Father?" "Jenica, there is no time for me to tell you what has happened, but this man must allow Vasily Loop to escape now, or everything I have ever worked for is finished." He took 2 splashing steps toward me and tried to grab the bone, but I changed it to the other hand and pushed him away. "There is no time," he shouted at me. "There is no time. You must let him escape, or he will be lost forever." "You must be out of your freaking mind," I screamed back at him. Do you know how many people have died? Do you know how many people have been turned into vampires? Of course I know, of course. This was how it was always meant to be. Now please allow the vampire gatherer to escape from the sunlight. I am begging you, please. He lunged at me again, but I took 2 steps back and he fell to his knees in the dwindling oval of water. He looked up at me in utter desperation, but it was too late. At that moment, the vampire gatherer let out one last multi-throated scream and burst into flame. The fire crackled and spat, and it was blinding, like burning magnesium. I couldn't look at it directly, but I could see that bit by bit it was erasing Vasily Loop's shadows, like a child rubbing out a drawing. Razvan Dragomir stayed where he was, on his knees, his gray pants soaked black, watching Vasily Loop with his mouth open in stupefaction, like an artist who sees his life's work destroyed right in front of his eyes. Jenica came cautiously down to the edge of the water and stood close to him, but none of us spoke, while the vampire gatherer was still on fire. As the last shreds of smoke fled away between the trees, however, there was a sound like the wind rushing, and the surface of the water actually shuddered. Something huge and invisible slammed between us, really close, like a truck that speeds past you on the highway and almost sucks you along with it. I turned around and looked at Jenica in bewilderment, and Jenica looked at me, but I could tell that she didn't know what it was either. Razvan Dragomir slowly stood up. At first, he appeared exactly like himself, the Razvan Dragomir I had seen in all of those blurry photographs in the Dragomir's apartment. Urbane, swarthy, with a very Romanian face, but as he rose to his full height, he grew taller and taller. His face began to distort, and his shoulders hunched over. I looked up at him, and although he still resembled Razvan Dragomir, he had changed into somebody else, too. His eyes were deep set, his slab-like cheeks were scarred with magical cicatrices, and he was wearing a living headdress made of cockroaches and beetles and wriggling larvae. "Miss Quamacus," I said. "You think that you are my nemesis, white man?" he said. I could feel his voice vibrating through the bones in my skull rather than my ears. "You think that you have defeated me?" I was breathless, and my heart was beating like a tom-tom. "Looks that way from where I'm standing." "You are a fool. You are a man of grass. Have I not shown you now that even in death I can never be defeated? I will remain your implacable enemy forever until the lands that were once ours are restored to us and your cities have vanished beneath the earth." "Miss Quamacus, you just don't get it, do you? We've lived in this country for 400 years now, and there's millions of us. And what do you think you're going to do? Kill every single one of us? You count for absolutely nothing. You don't even have your own spirit, for God's sake. Look at you, hiding inside some white man's soul." "Without me, this man is powerless," said Miss Quamacus. "Without me, he could never have raised up the vampire gatherer, and without the vampire gatherer, he could never have done what he so desired to do, and raise up the blood drinkers." "What are you saying?" Jenica demanded. She was almost hysterical. "What are you saying?" Miss Quamacus turned toward her, and his face went through an eerie transformation, like morphing, so that he looked much more like Jenica's father again. When he spoke, his voice was soft and rich and heavily accented. "My darling, Didn't I always tell you how wonderful the world could be if men and women were immortal? A world of learning and culture, a world in which genius was no longer buried, generation after generation. Yes, we would have to live by moonlight and conceal ourselves by day, but what a small price to pay. You raised Vasily Loop? Said Jenica. I always dreamed of it, but I could never do it until I found the sacred bone. I looked at him narrowly. The sacred bone? You mean this bone? It is the leg bone of Father Juan de Palos, who came to Florida in September of 1542 with the Spanish fleet of Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. Jenica shook her head as if she had water in her ears. I don't understand, Father. I don't understand. It isn't difficult, my darling. Father Juan was a vampiro, which is what the Spanish call the strigoi. Cabeza de Vaca had brought him on his expedition so that he could exterminate the Appalachian Indians, because they were so hostile to the Spanish explorers. But one night, off the coast of Florida, 5 of Cabeza de Vaca's ships were wrecked in a storm, and Father Juan was swept ashore and captured. When the sun rose, it burned him alive, as it does all strigoi. But a great Appalachian wonder-worker kept his leg bone and carved it with magical symbols and invested it with the power of Daquilán. In Appalachian legend, Daquilán is the Manitou who can call the dead from limbo to serve the living, or, if he so wishes, dismiss them back to limbo. The wonder-worker did this so that the Appalachian would have a weapon that they could use against any more strigoi that the Spaniard conquistadors brought with them, although, as it turned out, they never did. But why did you need it? I asked him. Because I wanted to rouse the strigoi, and the strigoi can only be roused from their coffins by one of the Sfarkolaki. And I discovered that, in his turn, the Sfarkolaki can only be roused from his coffin by the spirits of the land in which he finds himself. There are no Romanian spirits here in America, thousands of miles away from the Carpathian Mountains. George Vlad's plan to wipe out the Sioux would never have succeeded, because he would never have been able to wake up Vasily Loop, not without the sacred bone and the power of Daquilán. Jenica said, You never told me about this. You never even told me that you had found the strigoi's coffins. My darling, I found them many years ago. But what was the point of telling you that I had found them if I had no way of bringing them back to life? What was the point? I am your daughter. I am your flesh and blood. I am half Strigoica myself. Well, I am sorry if you think that I have deceived you. I wasn't sure that you would approve of what I wanted to do. You are so much like your dearest mother. How did you find the bone? Jenica demanded. She was so angry that she couldn't speak straight. It was very difficult, my darling. It took me more than 1/4 of a century. Sometimes I despaired, but I never gave up, because I knew it was a key to my great design. I discovered it at last in a private collection in Pascagoula. It was owned by an old woman, a retired anthropologist, who had no idea what it was or what it could do. Only the sacred bone could revive Vasily Loop, and only a Native American medicine man would understand the ritual to make it work. He gave a harsh, humorless laugh. After all of my years of searching, though, my great design almost came to nothing. Do you think I could find a Native American wonder-worker who understood how the bone worked or knew the rituals of Daquilán? I read all the books and articles I could find on Appalachian magic, but there was nothing about raising the dead. Then, like an act of God, came 9/11. Of course, I understood nothing of what had happened. How could I know that the fire in the World Trade Center towers had literally welded back together the spirit of Misquamacus? I only discovered this much later, when I was able to gain access once more to the vaults under St. Stephen's Church. As soon as I entered, I felt immediately as if I was blown up by a hurricane. Misquamacus entered me like a great wind and spoke to me. He gave me the power and the knowledge to use the bone so that I could bring Vasily Loop back to life. Talk about a deal with the devil, I said. Yes, if you wish to call it that. We made a deal. Misquamacus would revive Vasily Loop, and once he was revived, Misquamacus could live within him. Vasily Loop did not wish to be woken from his sleep, but he had no choice, and I left the bone in his casket so that he could never return to it. So you gave Misquamacus a war party of vampires? If you like. The Strigoi would feed on the blood of white men and anyone else whom Misquamacus counted as an enemy, but not, of course, on Native Americans. Within a few years, the Native Americans would have their lands returned to them by day, and the Strigoi would rule the country by night. Nice scenario, I told him. But Razvan Dragomir turned to Jenica. It is a tragedy that you had to interfere, my darling. You and this man, whoever he is. This could have been a golden age for two great peoples, the Native Americans and the Strigoi. I approached him and prodded him with the end of the bone. He stepped back almost as if it had shocked him, like a cattle prod. So this bone can call spirits out of limbo, can it? And it can send them back, too? Not without the Appalachian ritual. Oh, I don't think I need an Appalachian ritual. I just think I need to shove this sacred bone right where it hurts the most. Maybe I could do a bit of Dracula-style impaling, if you know what I mean. I prodded him again, and this time he literally jumped, and his eyes rolled up like an epileptic. I do not know who you are, but there is nothing you can do to stop the Strigoi now. They are everywhere, and every night there will be more of them, and more. Oh, yeah? That's what you think. The monster slayers are after them, changing woman's grandchildren, and they're going to hunt them all down, every single one of them, and frazzle them. And even if some of them manage to stay alive, or undead, or whatever it is, what do you think Misquamacus is going to do once all his enemies have been wiped out? We have a pact. We have an agreement. Native Americans by day, Strigoi by night. You might have Misquamacus hiding inside of your soul, sir, but you don't know him at all, do you? Do you seriously think that he's going to let a bunch of blood-sucking white folks roam around his precious prairies all night? He's using you, pal. He's using you to get his revenge. And once he's gotten his revenge, you and your vampires are going to be screwed back into your coffins where you all belong. Silence! Shouted Razvan Dragomir, and his face changed dramatically to the face of Misquamacus. He snatched at the bone, but he missed it, and I jabbed him with it again, and each time he convulsed. Strigoi! He roared. I need you! Strigoi, rise up and take this man! His blood is yours! Take it! I took a step back into the water. It was almost drained away now, but there was still 3 or 4 inches left. As I stepped back, though, a hand reached out of the reflection and seized my ankle. Another hand followed it, holding a triangular bladed kitchen knife, and it stabbed straight through my shoe and into the side of my foot. It hurt. I can't even describe how much it hurt. I shouted, "Get the hell off of me!" and whacked at the hands with the bone, but another hand appeared, and then another, until 20 or 30 of them had risen from the water to snatch at my feet and legs. They blistered and smoked because the sun was shining on them, but they started to drag me downward. I suddenly thought, shit, I'm half Strigoi myself, which means that I can be pulled into reflections too. I kept on struggling and hitting them with the bone, but the hands clung on harder and harder, and they wouldn't let go. Even though the water was only inches deep, it wasn't long before I had sunk into that morning sky reflection as far as my hips. "Jenica!" I shouted, but when I looked around, I saw her running away toward the inn. "Jenica!" Miss Quamacus came closer. "I am going to let these blood drinkers take you wherever they wish and slaughter you like a buffalo and empty your veins. Then I shall feed your carcass to the crows." I was frantic now, but the hands were too many, and they were much too strong for me. It took them less than a minute to pull me down into the reflection up to my chest, and soon I couldn't even swing my arm wide enough to knock them away. I saw 6 or 7 knives shining, and they started to stab at my buttocks and my thighs and my back. I shouted out with pain, but Miss Quamacus did nothing but stare at me, his headdress alive with insects. "Jenica!" I yelled, but now I couldn't see her at all, and already the Strigoi's fingers were clawing at the back of my shirt collar. "You have fought me many times," said Miss Quamacus, "but you cannot fight your destiny. Your destiny lies here, in this piece of sky." It was then that I realized where Jenica had gone. She must have run across to Susan Fireman's body and picked up her knife, and now she was standing right behind Miss Quamacus, where I couldn't see her. Without any warning at all, she reached around with one hand and cut his throat, just like that. One slice left to right. Then she stepped away from him. Her face was a picture of horror and alarm, like a character from a children's nursery book. Miss Quamacus was still staring at me, but his expression had changed entirely. Instead of triumphant, he looked disbelieving. He raised one hand toward his neck, but only halfway. As blood began to spout down his shirt, his face started to collapse and alter, and right in front of my eyes he shrank back into the features of Razvan Dragomir. By the time he was falling to the ground, he was no longer the vengeful Native American wonder worker, but the Romanian academic, Jenica's father, and he was plastered down to his knees in blood. At the same time, the Strigoi in the pond began to release me. The last of the water drained away, and they disappeared as if they had been sucked into a swamp. I found myself on my hands and knees, my pants soaked in blood, wet and coughing and cursing. Razvan Dragomir lay amid the heaps of pondweed, his blood squirting out of his neck, his eyes glazing over. As he lay there, I saw a glassy, liquid figure rise out of him, a figure that rippled in the morning sunlight. It was huge, and it was so cold and malevolent that ice began to crackle on the pondweed, and my breath steamed. Miss Quamacus, almost invisible now because his spirit had no ectoplasm. I held up the sacred bone of Dakelin. By all the power invested in me by a free America, in the name of common humanity, in the memory of Singing Rock, in the name of Changing Woman and the spirit of forgiveness, get the hell out of here. I saw things then that still gave me nightmares. As the fluid figure of Miss Quimacus grew larger and larger, I saw a living kaleidoscope of suffering and cruelty. I saw demons and gods. I saw crows gathering to turn the sky black, and herds of buffalo falling like landslides. I saw history like a huge river of screaming people carrying us all away. I swept the sacred bone from side to side and advanced on these visions as if I were going into battle. As I did so, I heard a hollow sucking sound, as if all the oxygen was being dragged out of the air. There was a split second of intense compression, and then there was a massive thunderclap. I was thrown backward across the pond and up against the concrete dam, jarring my shoulder. Stunned, I looked up. Miss Quimacus had gone, and the air had rushed in to fill the vacuum that he had left behind. Awkwardly, I stood up and limped out of the pond and up the slope. Jenica was sitting on the grass with her head bowed, still holding the bloody knife with which she had cut her father's throat. I stood beside her for a while, and then she looked up at me with tear-blotted eyes. "You're hurt," she said. "You're bleeding." The sun had risen high above the trees now, and the last scattered remains of the strigoi were smoldering into dead white ashes. The birds began to twitter again, and I saw cows moving in a distant field. I helped Jenica onto her feet, and then the two of us walked up toward the inn, saying nothing. As I climbed the steps, I stopped and turned around and looked up at the sky. Jenica said, "What is it?" "I don't know," I told her. "I think I was trying to see God." And that completes Manitou Blood by Graham Masterton. Thank you for listening to the whole story, 13 parts of it. And next Saturday, we'll be starting a new book. So in the comments below, I'd love to hear some suggestions of what you'd like me to read. I've had a few people already say that they would like for me to read The Charnel House by Graham Masterton. But hey, I'm open to anything that's available to us. So let me know what you'd like to hear. Do you want to hear another Graham Masterton book, or should we pick something else for a while? So anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I look forward to next Saturday morning.